It was certainly an adventure that when we started our class, the school was unaccredited. We were the third entering class. It was a way different world than it is today. Students were the admissions committee. The students, we had another committee where we interviewed and made recommendations on hiring of faculty members. As I mentioned to you before, we helped change this building from an insurance company into a law school.
We had all taken a leap of faith, and so we all shared this kindred pioneer spirit. We were all in this effort together. So we all stuck together in this voyage into the new frontier to build a law school.
I meet with the first year students here every year, and I explain to them that they're carrying on a culture that was created 40 some odd years ago, a culture that conveys that we are all in this together. You know, there was no razor blading of cases. We all wanted, all of us, to succeed, to graduate.
What drew you to Franklin Pierce?
When I drove up and there was this flamingo pink barn out in the middle of nowhere, and I interviewed with Kathy Green and with Jim Conway, who at that time were second or third year law students. It was so much not a law school. And the students had such enthusiasm for what it was and what they hoped it would become.
I had gotten involved in politics when I came out of the service in 1970 and had gotten to know Ed Muskie and George Mitchell and others, and I admired them for their ability to use their legal minds to solve public policy problems. I was taken by the fact that the school was not traditional. Not only was it in a bull barn of a farm, but more importantly, the structure of the academics was very strongly oriented not only to science, but for my interest for economics.
My response is pretty easy. It's the only law school I got into. I was on a waiting list someplace else and I didn't want to wait. So I came here.
I went here because I was from New Hampshire. I had no money. So I could not afford to go to Boston or go to Denver. I wanted to go to Denver. A lot of people came from out of state not intending to practice in New Hampshire, and the law school wasn't accredited at the time.
Yeah, that was a wing and a prayer for them to come here with under those limitations.
Between undergrad and law school, I was a community organizer in the Boston area and some of the challenging communities, and I wanted to be in an environment that appreciated the need to focus on the societal needs. And I may have been naive, but I thought at the time going to an Antioch or University of Connecticut or something, their focus would be, first off, a much larger school and a focus more on the corporate world, which ironically is where I spend all my time now. But
and I was one of the few who went right from college to law school. And so now I'm going to, and I didn't get it. I wasn't accepted to any school in New York City, so I got accepted into some schools like Western New England or Franklin Pierce, and I went. I had a good interview at Franklin Pierce, so I decided to go there, and so now here I am. Really, the first time I'm living away from home, and I'm going to college. I'm going to Franklin Pierce, which is a new school, and so it was as if Franklin Pierce and I were growing up together, you know.
Both my parents passed this past year, and they had my father had a tremendous amount of influence on me he was always wanting me to pursue law. And when I was considering taking some time off, because that was the way a lot of the students were, he was very, very adamant and said to me, he encouraged me to go straight to school because he was concerned that if I did not continue, I might enjoy other things and not circle back to law.
Just the whole interview process, the fact that students were involved, that, it was such a relaxed sort of laid-back atmosphere, I must say. I mean, it was like very relaxed. I mean, who knew that law school was going to be that hard? Listen, we were all a bunch of hippies back then, you know, sort of hippies. I mean, I was like I was a little older, but you know, we had lived through this tumultuous period in our country's history.
It was back in the time when things like the draft still existed, and in my particular case, the lottery system, which I did not win. So near the middle of my first year at the University of Virginia, I ended up being drafted. I could have gone back to UVA. It just wasn't to my taste at that point. Having developed a passion for skiing while I was in the Air Force, I applied at a number of schools that had nearby skiing facilities. I was accepted at them, but I chose Frank's.
I worked full-time before going to law school and decided to go back to law school, as did many in our class. They'd been out of school for some time. So I'd applied to a couple of schools in Washington, D.C., a couple in Boston, and this Franklin Pierce Law Center in Concord, New Hampshire. So I go in and I have the interview. Now I'm interviewed by two students, then 2L by the name of Kathy Green, and then 1L by the name of Deborah, then Kane, now Rain. Finally I say, just a minute. Really, why should I come to this place? And I'm paraphrasing, but they looked at me and said, Kris, New Hampshire needs a good law school, and we're going to build one. And we'd like you to help us and be part of that. Sold.
Law school may have started off for me as a very, very bad idea. I always wanted to go to law school. I was 27, I had 2 children. I was accepted, and we decided that we would mortgage our home, put together our savings, and head up to a place called Concord, New Hampshire. So the week before, we rented a U-Haul, put all our belongings in.
What happened was George was moving up there with his whole family, and so he was getting a truck, and he had to move his washing machine and everything else. But I didn't have as much stuff, so I said, let's split it, and we'll bring my stuff over to you.
That morning when I awoke, the truck had been stolen with all of the belongings. Franklin Pierce looked like a pretty bad idea.
He called up the next morning, everything was stolen. So now I have to start school. I had really no clothes or anything. I had to go up there and buy shoes, and I had nothing. The first year, everything happened there, but that was just the beginning of many crazy things that happened that first year.
That weekend, all of my relatives showed up at my house with an envelope. Everybody contributed $100 or $200. A very good friend of mine who was fairly affluent showed up with an envelope of $3,000. We got a paddle truck the next day, and I borrowed whatever I could from friends and relatives. When I did graduate, all those relatives who showed up with the $100 bills and my best man who had showed up with $3,000, they needed an attorney for their closing. They needed an attorney for their last will and testament. Thanks to Dane Buck, I learned a little bit about the 1976 Tax Reform Act. I did their tax returns. My best man, he was involved in businesses for about 25 years. I represented him in all those businesses. None of those people ever got a bill. I was grateful for what they have done for me, but I think I paid it back in the long run.
What was your reaction first time seeing the bull barn?
Yeah, the bull barn. What an adventure.
I was blown away. I don't remember Morgan ever telling me that it was in a bull farm, frankly. We all were friendly in it. It was like, these are my kind of people, you know? It was just a wonderful feeling. So we all laughed about the facilities together.
What attracted me was that they had attracted people from the real world, both professors and practitioners, to start a law school. And they had a different idea about what the law school would be. And so the bull farm was sort of a metaphor for that different approach.
It just sort of added to the atmosphere of my being able, for example, to go into a professor's office without an appointment and just sort of walk in and hang out. And you know, it was that kind of an atmosphere.
We smile when we describe it as a former bull breeding barn. It was more than a barn when we moved in, but that's how the building started. It was actually painted pink on the outside up on Mountain Road, pink. The library constituted a main library, and then little annexes were in where the bull stalls used to be. Okay. And so there were never enough chairs to go around. There was only one copier. My young son David loved making copies for my classmates. They'd give him the nickels, he'd put them in, he'd make copies.
What I thought more about was that drive along, that drive and along this, single. I had just got my driver's license. You don't have to drive in New York City. I remember, so I'm driving. I'm driving on. I was driving with two other people in the class, Fred Levy and Terry Harmon, and I was driving, and this guy comes on a bicycle, kind of cuts me off, and I almost hit him. And so after that, they didn't want to drive with me anymore. But I think that ride on that one-lane road all the way down to the school was really interesting.
There were law students who were very entrepreneurial and started a place to get something to eat downstairs. That was the Nail Brothers. You could get a bagel or a donut or a coffee or an English muffin or something. We were out in the middle of nowhere. But because there was not a lot of support like you have today at the law school, we all had to fend for ourselves and we had to depend on each other.
Because there was nothing else out in East Concord. I mean, you had to drive 3 or 4 miles to get to anything to find something to eat. And most everybody brought, people would bring stuff to eat, and it was like, going to camp in many respects.
There was only one large classroom, and the class would be divided in half. So half the class faced the other half, and with a runway, kind of runway down the middle, and the professors would stride up and down the runway conducting class. We would take our seats in the morning, and we would stay put, and the professors would change.
I sat in the back of the room with a group of, unfortunately, older guys who Professor Dickinson kind of nicknamed the Zoo. As best as I can remember, the Zoo consisted of Bugley was back there, Buxton, Bruce Berger, wherever he is today, Steve White, Cahill, and Mertens. And the name came because we always had some, for lack of a better word, a wise-ass comment about something.
We all had our places where we sat all the time. So my little coterie, I remember Tom Watson was there, and Mike Marino, remember him, Terry Harmon. Where were you sitting?
I always sat in the front.
Yeah, another one of those front. Yeah, I was not in the front.
And so what you had to do if you were teaching, you had to walk from the front end to the back end. And of course, you'd get people raising their hand at the front end when you were at the back end saying, I can't hear. And then you'd go to the back end, and of course, you'd see people looking at the newspaper, and you'd say, you kind of put that down. I'm now at the back end of the room, so we can now talk about civil procedure.
One night I'll remember, I think it was early spring of '76. I'd been at the library studying, and I was on my way home, leaving the library. I stuck my head in, and I said, good night, Dean Viles. He said, hey, Kris, you got a minute? I said, sure. So I go in, and he says, I really got to ask you a question because I'm just worried about something. He says, Concord Insurance Company is building itself a new headquarters. They have a building in Concord. It's on the corner of Washington and White Street, and they've offered it to us, and I just don't know what to do. It's so much money. There's no land, there's no parking. I just don't know. Could you just maybe take a drive by and let me know what you think? I said, sure. So the next day, I think it was, I drove by, and I come up, and here is this absolutely beautiful brick building with white columns next to a beautiful park. And I said to myself, wow, this is a real law school.
The Viles come in one day to explain what was going to happen. And Bob was very accessible, but Peter thought this was important. And he's opened by saying, "Follow me from the mountaintop to the city." The Bull Barn was a temporary arrangement, and while it was, this building was not anything like what it is today, it was marvelous. The wind didn't blow through the windows. The instructors had actual offices, so you could have office hours.
I was never a big fan of the Bull Farm. There were people who sort of thought it was kind of neat, because it was filled with flies and it was filled with everything that you'd associate with a barn. It was definitely a barn. It was unique, and it was important to get out of there as quickly as possible, in my view.
Sort of formalize things a little. The school is here to stay, so it kind of gave us a little bit of an uplift also, but there was a little bit of nostalgia about leaving the barn.
I think the faculty was the difference. There were some truly talented people, and all very highly motivated. Some of them were professors at other law schools. Peter Brown, for example, had taught at a law school. He'd been a deputy general counsel at the Pennsylvania Public Utilities Commission and a deputy attorney general for Pennsylvania. Obviously, Bob Viles and Bob Rhines, the two founders, came from significant careers. Bob Viles was from Maine. He was in many ways a quintessential Mainer gone a little bit haywire.
And he's the inscrutable fellow with the Van Dyke beard. Well before Van Dyke beards became popular, he taught contracts and put the fear of God in all of us.
And he came into contracts class with a weapon of mass destruction. I don't know if anybody remembers or said it. That was a fly swatter.
We were told most of the manure was gone, but the residual effect of nests of particularly the flies.
There wasn't much of a hierarchy between the faculty and the students. And so the students were challenging, outspoken, and not afraid to say what they thought about what was going on. Bob Viles was very much into that, and he would meet with students, he would meet with faculty, and get their input, and that's how he sort of ran the law school for years.
Bob Rhines wrote the procession music for our graduation. He had written an opera. He and his father had done the Xerox patent. It just goes, and he was obviously looking for the Loch Ness Monster, and I thought that was just complete hooey until I saw the photographs. It might still be complete hooey, but it was very interesting.
Was able to take this building and create a law school, and which was pretty amazing.
Visionary about the intersection of law and technology back in the 70s, and look where we are today. And it's such a terrific and important niche for our school.
In many ways, Bob Rhines's worldview is we, they, us against them. Loyalty to Bob Rhines, anyway, was a big deal, and these folks responded to that with giving all the loyalty that we could have ever asked for.
My impression of Rhines is this mixture of this guy creates more problems than he solves. On the other hand, he's terribly gifted in a lot of different ways. And I thought, we ought to be searching for ways to take advantage of that.
Joe Dickinson, I have to say in my interview here with him, he seemed openly skeptical of my interest in this school. He had a true gift of gab and a witticism that was almost overwhelming, and it would have been were he not so easy to interact with.
But Joe Dickinson stands out. He was great. He was close to our age. He was enthusiastic. He was challenging. He was excited.
I don't know if we'll ever get over his study of the first American judicial systems among the Indians, which he certainly labored to make us appreciate.
And the idea of the Cherokee Indian law, it was, you could look at an entire legal system from the inside to its guts to the top and see the whole thing. I remember when I went to law school, the first class I went to, somebody said, "Where does law come from?" And of course, somebody in the back of the room says, "God." Well, this in some ways was addressed at answering that question. Somebody in this class submitted an examination in the legal process course, which was 4 pages of iambic pentameter. And every line rhymed. And I go, how did it, and the question was a statutory construction problem. How do you do that? It's the best thing I've ever seen. It was just terrific.
And of course, my eventual partner, Peter Brown, even though he gave me a B in civil procedure, we ended up spending 25 years as partners, so I suppose it all worked out in the end.
I came here in the summer of '75 because Bob Rhines and Bob Viles wanted me to set up the internship program, the external internship program. And they said to me, "It really is not much to do. It's already here, ready to go, and all you have to do is make a few phone calls, and that would be it." I think the foolishness on my part was to believe them. There was nothing there. But this class was the first class I taught. I remember them well. They were a very interesting group. I can't imagine how they ended up here. I never could figure that out.
You know, it was serious stuff. I mean, we learned the law. And I mean, I had Hesse for 3 classes. And, you know, that guy worked us to the bone. Research and writing, I remember having to put in, this is my first year, having to put in just an enormous amount, probably because I was obsessive about it. I mean, I probably didn't have to, and I'm sure other students didn't put in nearly as much time. Dick gave an assignment one day in class, and I raised my hand. I said, I'm not going to do it. I'm just not going to do it. It's ridiculous, you know? I mean, I just said, you know, why should we have to do all this work for a 1-credit course? It's absurd. He said, "Come up to my office and let's talk about it." So I went up to his office. He sat behind, it was like a judge, and I had to do, it was my first oral argument. He was behind his desk, and I stood in front of him, and I made my case. And I can't remember whether I won or whether I lost. It was, you know, it was that kind of give and take. He did such a, I mean, I've never forgotten it.
I took the job seriously. Almost all of the students signed on to that. Very few that, what shall I say, were inappropriately casual. They were more personable, they were more engaged. So the class of '78 for me has turned out to be the fondest memories, or the strongest memories.
I had a great time with those professors, particularly Dean Simpson and...
Remember Dean Simpson's midterm exam?
No.
Oh, good. Everybody just took the tubes. It was panic.
He gave me my first C, and I almost had a heart attack. I made an appointment and met with him and said, "What have I done wrong? I mean, I'm used to being very successful academically, and I got a C." And really, I just didn't know what to do. I was beside myself. And so he spent time with me, and I said, "Will you allow me to do this paper again?" And he did, and so I improved.
I wrote a nice paper once for Hugh Gibbons. He gave me an A-. That was exciting.
Hugh Gibbons was my favorite, mostly because I think he and I thought in similar ways. Well, he may very well be another reason why I transitioned so well into the alternative energy generation area, because as you may remember, he certainly challenged us all to abandon preconceptions, creatively approach problems, and not be afraid to learn new things.
He was a smoker, as was I at the time, and a bunch of people. But people were complaining about smoking. So he decided to have a vote to see whether people could smoke in class or not.
In class?
In class, yeah, we smoked in class. People used to
I wasn't in that class.
and people voted. It was overwhelming to not allow smoking in the class.
So he lit one up?
He said, doesn't matter. Our class represented every conceivable political point of view. But that didn't stop us from being able to have meaningful conversations. And it never stopped us from trying to learn from each other.
Students were very close. Students with professors were very close. It wasn't a traditional stodgy type of environment.
We went to law school at a time of mini revolution in our society, and many of us went just for that reason. Franklin Pierce Law Center was equal to that task and more, and having the opportunity to go to Franklin Pierce Law Center is, next to my children, the greatest gift I've ever received.
I just really hope that people will love this school as much as I know I love it. My classmates love it, and it's really something special.